The windows were boarded up from the inside. The nails, hammered in by a trembling hand, were rusty with moisture, and the panes behind them were covered with frost, as if someone had breathed on them from another world. The Palace of St. Paul smelled of fallen wool. A servant who had dared to enter without knocking later said he found the king standing in the center of the room with a torch held to his own shadow. He insisted that she was whispering to him and that she must be burned or she would bring the English. It was the end of November in the year 1424. Charles, the sixth king of the Valois dynasty, was by then no longer ruling officially. Yes, de jure, he was still monarch, but in reality, power had long since passed to the Dauphin, Prince Charles, and the Duke of Burgundy. The king himself was isolated. His days were spent in silence and stench. The rooms where he lived were rarely ventilated. The dense tapestries had not been removed since summer. They were wet with condensation, covered with fungus. The walls rotted beneath them. The first records of repeated attacks were made by the physician Jean de Montet. His Majesty screams again at his reflection. He refuses to drink water and demands the holy liquid of Paris. In attempting to examine him, he bites the apothecary. At the same time, began to notice a sharp deterioration in the condition of the skin. The king appeared many cracks, especially in the corners of the mouth and on the palms of his hands. He complained of itching that crawled from the inside out. A doctor's examination revealed multiple abscesses under the skin. They began to use vinegar compresses, but there was no effect. In one of the reports of the captain of the city guard, it is recorded, "On the night of the seventh day, I was summoned, because from the window of the royal chambers, there were cries of treachery and flames. On arriving, I saw His Majesty smashing a mirror with a staff and demanding the arrest of his own beard. These attacks became more and more frequent. Sometimes they could be stopped with poppy, sometimes not. In the second half of December, his condition worsened. Karl stopped recognizing members of the court. He confused the living and the dead. Once he talked to an empty chair for 2 hours, thinking that his brother Louis, who had been murdered nearly 2 decades earlier, was sitting there. According to the monk Fernand, during these days, he did not discern time. He would say, "Soon it will be 1,000 years since I have sat on this throne, and 1,000 more before the end of the war." His speeches were recorded and kept in the secret archives of the palace, as some phrases were seen as prophecies. The temperature in the chambers was low, but Charles would not allow a fire to be built. He claimed that smoke attracts the beast from beneath the earth. He slept in a fur robe that had not been washed since spring and which gave off a sweetish odor of decay. Later, on examination, it was discovered the cloth had absorbed pus from sores that had opened on his back. They oozed continuously. The servants who served the king were replaced twice in a month. Each time, due to illness or fear, one of them disappeared. Another later admitted under oath that he had heard 3 voices coming from the chambers at night. One aged, one female, and the third, a voice that sounded neither human nor beastly. The medical council, meeting on Christmas Eve, decided to begin intensive bloodletting. First 2 bowls a day, then 3. The king was restrained with belts. He resisted, tearing the bandages, screaming a curse. On the 5th day, the skin on the inside of his arms began to peel off. The blood, according to the Dr. Martin of Tours, was dark brown in color and had a pungent odor. Infection was suspected. The monks offered to exorcise evil spirits. They performed rituals, sprinkled holy water on the walls. One day, after a ritual, a rat ran out from under Charles's bed and devoured a candle. The king shouted, "There it is, the shadow. It's in there now." From that moment on, he refused to lie down on his bed. He spent the last weeks sitting on the floor, wrapped in his cloak and staring at one point. Winter had begun. The chambers were cold, smelling of wet straw, medicine, sweat. The sores on his legs began to fester. One of the servants who had snuck into the room during the attack claimed to have seen white worms crawling from a wound on his thigh. The medics did not confirm, but from that day on, entry to the chambers was restricted. Only the doctor, a monk, and guards were allowed access. In late January, the king stopped speaking. He moved his lips, but made no sound. A scribe managed to read the words. "I burned it, but now she is everywhere." It was believed that he was talking about his shadow. It was then that they began to record a complete loss of appetite. The king drank only warmed wine, diluted with opium. The stools became liquid, with blood in them. There was a strong odor of sulfur. The King of France, once a brilliant ruler, had become a source of fear. Messengers from other courts no longer asked for an audience. He was no longer remembered at Mass. Only a priest from Rouen, in a letter to the Archbishop, wrote, "He is not dead yet, but he has already become a sign. Even the angels are turning away from him." By early February, Charles was not getting up. He was wrapped in linen bandages soaked in vinegar and myrrh. But the sores continued to fester. There was a smell of rotten meat. One of the monks who visited him developed headaches and skin rashes. A week later, he died. Then they began to suspect body contagion. Access to the chambers was reduced again. The body was processed through a slit in the door. Meanwhile, the political situation was heating up. Rumors spread in Paris that the Dauphin was preparing to declare himself sole monarch. In Burgundy, abdication was demanded. Secret negotiations began between the dukes, but the king was still alive, and that prevented an open division of power. The body continued to decompose. A doctor's examination through a slit showed that the nails had fallen off. The eyes were blurred. The stomach was bloated. Karl lay motionless, but he was breathing, sometimes sharply, wheezing, sometimes quietly, as if he were falling asleep. But death did not come. One of the guards left the palace in a panic, saying he saw the king smiling in a dark corner. It was the last winter of Charles VI. Part 2. Karl died on the night of February 6th. Death did not come at once. First, his breathing stopped. Then, according to the monk Benedict, his heart beat 3 more times, like a bell that calls but waits for no answer. When he was carried out, the odor was such that the servants held sponges soaked in vinegar. One of them later died of fever. The body was carried in a closed box, padded inside with wax. An attempt at embalming failed. The tissue was too damaged, the insides destroyed. The blood clotted before the autopsy. The chest was dark, almost black. The eyes wouldn't close, so they were covered with a cloth. The same day, the Dauphin called a secret council. The statement read, "The king died of old age and prayers." However, the chronicler Etienne, who was at court, noted no one believed. Everyone was silent. Not even the candles burned in the chapel. Panic broke out in the city. Many were convinced that Charles's death would bring retribution. Rumors spread that the king had left a secret will where he renounced the throne and asked that his body be buried without honor. He was not buried for 3 days. The bishops debated whether it was permissible to say Mass for someone who burned his own shadow. When the body was finally taken to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the procession was accompanied by silence. No flowers were thrown, no tears were cried. Someone threw a rowan branch towards the coffin, a symbol of the banishment of the unclean. After the funeral, they closed the king's chambers, nailing the doors shut with boards. They were not opened for more than 20 years. The death of Charles VI opened an era of new turmoil. The Dauphin proclaimed himself Charles VII, but Burgundy refused to recognize him. The English increased pressure. There was a purge at court. Old courtiers disappeared, replaced by younger ones. No one ever mentioned the name of Charles VI again, but in the memoirs of the monk Fernand, he was a king whose soul was accepted neither by heaven nor hell. He became ashes among the living. Death occurred on the night of February 5th to 6th at the 2nd hour. The only witnesses were Friar Benedict, the physician Guillaume Leroy, and one of the bodyguards. Charles lay on his side, unmoving for almost 3 days, but his eyes remained open. His breathing was becoming more and more infrequent, with a moist wheeze. According to Benedict, the last sound was not a word, but a sob, like sucking in Tina. After that, the pulse disappeared. The heart beat 3 more times, at long intervals. Then there was complete silence. The doctor noted in his report, the skin on the arms was already separating. The chest was swollen. Yellow fluid with a mixture of mucus and blood oozed from the nose and ears. The eyes would not close. The eyelids would not bend. At the monk's insistence, the body was immediately wrapped in a linen cloth soaked in vinegar and myrrh. But within an hour, decomposition began. Stains seeped out from under the cloth. There was a sharp odor of fat and rot. One of the guards at the door later described it as smelling like a cellar where meat had been forgotten. Officially, the death was announced as natural, from exhaustion and years of illness. But this declaration was not accompanied by the ringing of bells. There was a strange silence in the Palace of Saint Paul. The next day, the body was attempted to be embalmed. The procedure was interrupted at the first stage. After opening the abdomen, the insides leaked out, almost without resistance. The liver had decayed. The stomach emitted a musty odor, and the lungs were filled with a murky liquid. The blade of the knife, in the surgeon's words, slid like slurry. An attempt to close his eyes failed. On the 3rd day, the tissue darkened. Insects began to appear. Then they decided not to display the body for a public farewell. It was placed in a box, padded inside with wax, and sealed with sealing wax. The coffin was carried by 6 men, all wearing gloves, their faces covered with handkerchiefs soaked in horseradish and wine. One of them later fainted right on the street. He was taken to the monastery, where he died on the 4th day. The funeral took place at dawn on February 8th. Instead of a procession, there were 4 carts and 20 guards. None of the nobles came. No flowers were thrown in the streets, no wailing. Only women, hiding their faces, stood at the windows. In the Basilica of St. Denis, Mass was held with the doors closed. Monk Anselm noted in a note, "The singing was interrupted 3 times. One of the singers lost his voice. The candles went out from a wind that was not there. There was no royal coat of arms on the coffin, just a simple cross carved in charcoal. The servants who carried the body later complained of joint pain, headaches and vomiting. One died 2 days later. Another was found in the barn, hanged with a note. He did not close his eyes. He saw. Afterward, the royal chambers were sealed. All personal belongings, clothes, staff, books, mirrors, were burned in the courtyard of the Louvre. The fire burned long. The smoke was thick and sweet. The ashes were ordered to bury, but according to the clerk's report, some of it was scattered by the wind. On the same day, the Dauphin, son of Charles, convened a secret council. He declared himself Charles VII. Only 2 words were spoken. The rest is complete. No tears, no oaths, only agreement with his eyes. The chronicler of Arras noted, "What struck everyone most of all was not death, but the fact that no one was surprised." On the table in front of the Dauphin lay a parchment, probably prepared in advance. The coronation was postponed. He received no one that day. In the evening, one of the monks who remained in the chambers for prayer reported that he heard behind the wall something beating and calling by name. He was released to Rouen. He never returned. Court clerk Renaud recorded, "After death came anxiety, but not because of power. It was because death left no silence." 3 days after the funeral, a beam collapsed from the ceiling in the chapel of St. Denis. No one was hurt, but at the sight of the fall, there was blackness, which could not be washed away with water or wine. After that, the room was reconsecrated. The next day, the altar light in the church did not come on. Then it was decided to remove Charles's name from the list of names for which Sunday prayers are read. Rumors began to spread in Paris. It was said that Charles's body never cooled down. Others claimed that he died without confession, and now he can't leave. In the markets, shopkeepers whispered his shadow remained in the walls. Priests condemned such speech, but did not refute. It was considered dangerous to deny what had not yet been forgotten. The death of Charles VI did not create grief. It created emptiness. His name was no longer spoken. Documents began to refer to him simply as the one who was. Masses made no mention of his soul. The coffin in St. Denis was waxed and sealed with metal spikes to keep out rats, but everyone knew it wasn't just rats. One priest refused to consecrate the coffin, saying, "There's more root than rest in this tree now." A week later, he went down with a fever. Thus ended the king's life, but not his power. It flowed out like pus, leaving traces in the air, and no one knew how long it would take for the odor to disappear. In the spring of that year, signs of a new wave of fear began. A report came from Lana that an unknown fever had broken out in the monastery of St. Catherine. It came on suddenly, first headache, then fever, then ulcers on the inside of the thigh. Ulcers on the inner thigh and neck. Several brothers died within 3 days. The locals said, "This is the return of the king. He is rotting in us." Despite attempts by church authorities to link the outbreak to contaminated water, fear had already spread through the dioceses. In Paris, 2 weeks after the funeral, a fire broke out in the northern part of the city. Several warehouses and a house belonging to Charles's former physician burned. He was believed to have kept copies of medical reports on the king's condition. as well as personal notes on symptoms. All that remained of the house was a smoldered foundation. No one looked for the culprits. The city council ruled, "The fire shall not be investigated to avoid confusion." The chronicler Boucher wrote, "In the fire disappeared what was feared more than war, the truth about the body of the sovereign." Meanwhile, the new king, Charles the 7th, began to assert power. His first decrees were to forbid the mention of his father's name in print, at mass and in public speeches. An order of March 15th ordered the burning of any manuscripts containing the expressions "king without a shadow," "the seventh voice," or "the Black Room." The archives at the Louvre, where the diaries of courtiers from the time of Charles II were closed. The minutes of the council meeting read, "It is not a question of memory, but of order. The state cannot be the heir to madness. Memories, however, could not be burned out." Senior servants whispered that in those very chambers, boarded up and forgotten, candles lit themselves. One of the guards committed suicide by writing, "I heard him calling for me." After this, the guard at the closed doors was removed altogether. The rooms were left to time. But through the cracks, according to stories, there was sometimes a warm, spicy air. In June, a preacher was arrested in Rouen, who during Mass declared, "Charles was not punished for madness, but for the truth." His interrogation lasted 3 days. He claimed that he had seen a dream where the king, chained in chains, rose from his coffin and walked through the streets of Paris, leaving behind a trail of blood and exclamations. The minutes of the interrogation are preserved in the archives of Toulouse. He said that he knew who had substituted the shadow of the sovereign. He knew the name, but did not pronounce it. He died when the mirror was shown to him. Meanwhile, Burgundy, which refused to recognize Charles VII, entered into negotiations with England. Ambassadors arrived at Calais, where they discussed the possibility of transferring the French throne to the son of the English king. Paris responded with silence. Everyone understood the transition of power into the hands of the Dauphin was a political fact, but not spiritual. The dead, Charles remained in the air, in the streets, in the smells. The chronicler Geoffroy wrote, "People do not believe words. They believe the air, and the air still smells of the mantle." Even in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, where the body rested, the attendants began to notice that in the area around the king's tomb, candles were smoking and extinguishing more frequently. One of the monks in charge of the altar collapsed during the evening service and died 2 days later of a fever. Toward the fall, word began to circulate at court that Charles had not died his own death. There was no official investigation, but among the nobility circulated notes accusing the Duke of Burgundy. They claimed that shortly before the last attack, Charles was fed decoction on the blood of a drowned man, allegedly on the advice of a doctor who came from Dijon. It was impossible to verify the truth. The body had been destroyed. The physicians were silent, and the Duke himself denied involvement. The new king's inner circle suffered from paranoia. The courtiers avoided even mentioning the word shadow. In one of the Louvre rooms where Charles's portrait used to hang, there was now an empty niche draped in black cloth. No one touched it. A chaplain passing by once said, "The empty space is louder than a scream." He was transferred to an abbey in the north. Charles VII himself suffered from insomnia in those months. His personal physician left notes. Pulse weak, hands cold, often asks to sprinkle water on the bed, says he hears his father's footsteps. In one of his audiences, he forbade the mention of any and burned the pen with which he signed his first decree. The scribe who witnessed it later disappeared. But worst of all was the popular fear. Ordinary Parisians believed that Charles's spirit had not left the palace. It was rumored that on the 40th day after his death in the St. Paul Quarter, a boy saw a man in a royal robe who stood with his back to him and whispered, "You are now my voice." People soon began to gather at the boy's spot. Later, someone scratched on the wall, "He has returned for what was taken away." By fall, the town lived in silence. The taverns closed early. Masses did not mention the name of the king, past or present. In documents, it was increasingly common to write simply, "Sovereign." Charles VII was gaining ground, but no one was in a hurry to call him the true monarch. It was believed that France had not yet been purified. The Archbishop of Orleans said, "If the shadow is not burned, it returns." The memory of Charles VI was not forgotten, it became taboo. And that's what kept it alive. In December of the year 1425, a traveling scribe named Thibaut arrived in Chartres. He claimed to be the secretary of the last chaplain of Charles VI. He was carrying a scroll wrapped in an old robe. It contained 27 sheets, written in a scrawled hand. Some were stained, some were faded, but almost all of them contained the same repetitive fragment. "I see myself in the mirror, but the reflection is silent. Then which of us rules?" The scribe disappeared 3 days later. His body was found in the river, his face disfigured by stones. The scroll was gone. Only a letter from the abbot of Troyes to the Bishop of Reims records its existence. Meanwhile, in Paris, people associated with the late king continued to disappear. First of all, old servants. In February, a former bodyguard and one of the doctors disappeared without a trace. They were followed at night. No body, no explanation. In the same days, the treasurer of the royal household died of a stroke. It was rumored that shortly before his death, he had tried to sell a collection of Charles's personal belongings, including a carved chest with teeth-like marks carved inside. The priest who saw the object, refused to talk. He was taken to a monastery where he stopped speaking altogether. Charles VII increasingly complained of suffocation. The doctors recorded strong heart palpitations and attacks of nausea at night. His personal valet, Guillaume d'Armagnac, in a private correspondence wrote, "He wakes up in a cold sweat, says that someone sits at his headboard. Once ordered to take out the mirror and forbade to bring again. He said, 'I don't want to see who was there anymore.'" In March, the Archbishop of Paris initiated a meeting on the issue of cursed remains. Under this title lurked the question, what to do with the objects that belonged to the late Charles. They were found: a comb that had developed a crack in the shape of a face, a shoe with skin that had turned blue, and a small jug with the remains of a wine infusion. The liquid inside had darkened and emitted an odor described by one monk as a mixture of incense and soap that had not been washed for a long time. All of these items were ordered to be burned. During the rite, however, one of the novices went blind. Doctors attributed this to an inflammation of the optic nerve. the faithful to the fact that he had touched the legacy of madness. At the same time, the Duke of Breton began demanding security guarantees from the crown. His letter stated, "The shadow of the throne is great. We want to know that a second voice is not hidden beneath it." The wording was deliberately vague, but in the capital, it was taken literally. Newspaper reporters began to whisper, "The king's voice still resounds, in the heads, in records, in dusty corners." The heightened fear coincided with a crisis in the army. In the spring, a dozen officers complained of nightmares. One of them, named Alain de Sauce, described them as follows: "I see a king, naked, in chains. He looks at me and smiles. I can't wake up until I say his name." The army commander ordered silence, but the fear spread. There was an incident in the garrison of Cambrai. A soldier, painting a chapel, wrote on one of the walls the name of Charles instead of God. It was noticed. He was beaten, then hanged without trial. Meanwhile, there was a growing schism in the clergy. Some priests argued that Karl's name should be included in the list of victims of the curse, rather than excluded altogether. This would make it possible to give him a new funeral service. Others, by contrast, insisted on oblivion. One priest, the Dominican Francois, wrote, "If you give a name, he will return. If pain is acknowledged, the gate will open." He was transferred to a monastery in Provence, where he soon died of suffocation. Charles VII, at this time, stopped going out into the garden. He moved the chambers to another wing of the Louvre and ordered the old bedroom to be burned. In the burning, the walls cracked. Dark gnats flew out of one of the stones. According to the builder's records, one of the workers became ill. At the same time, Charles gave the order, "It is forbidden to speak of mirrors in the presence of the crown." The first signs of the alienation of power became visible in August. For the first time in many years, the royal seal was signed in the name of the Chancellor. This caused controversy. Some spoke of the king's illness, others of a curse. At the same time, the old coats of arms began to disappear from archives, from stone reliefs. On the wall of Saint-Denis, someone scratched, "He was, and he will be, as long as you are afraid." Nevertheless, the political structure was maintained. Burgundy became closer to the crown, but is still referred to as an unfaithful ally in secret documents. New faces began to appear in the embassies, people born after Charles's madness. They remembered nothing, and that was what frightened the old courtiers. If memory was gone, fear must return to replace it. By the fall, the church again raised the question of Charles's canonical status. It was decided he was to be neither canonized nor damned. The wording was, "Rejected, but not rejected." That became the official position. And in the king's former chambers, boarded up on the day of his death, the fire was lit again. At night, the guards noticed smoke. No one went inside. They only heard the rustling of cloth and the sound of footsteps. In the winter of 1426th year, in the vicinity of Paris, rumors that a group of beggars found a body part on the old road in the area of the former hunting grounds. A charred hand, wearing a gilded ring with the Valois coat of arms. The ring was recognized. Only 3 men had worn it in Charles VI's lifetime. One was alive. The second died in battle. The third was the court treasurer who disappeared 6 months ago. He was never found. The body was never investigated. The priest summoned to consecrate the site refused to come any closer. This is not death, it's a return. Charles VII hardly showed his face in public from that time on. His new bedroom was lined with incense and clay. All the fabrics were black. He had mirrors removed and ordered himself to be sprinkled with holy water every night. In a February report, the doctor wrote, "He's losing his sense of time." Says his father whispers through the floor, afraid of the window. At masses, the king's name was read as heir to the throne, taking care to avoid superfluous words. In official documents, for the first time in 30 years, the phrase appeared, "with the shadow of the past unfinished." In the spring, a group of preachers who called themselves the Eyes of the Dead King appeared in Amiens in northern France. They were accused of heresy. They claimed that Charles had not died, but had been left by the body. They were quickly arrested. When questioned, it turned out that they did not know each other. They all said they began to hear a voice at the same time, in the different places. The voice kept repeating, "You have forgotten the light," but he remembers. A report of the case was sent to Paris. The council under the king decided to classify the material. However, a copy survived in the private collection of Abbot Celeste. He wrote, "Nothing supernatural, only fear that took shape." He was strangled at the inn 2 weeks later. The killer was never identified. Inside the Louvre, architectural changes gradually began. The walls of the old chambers began to damp. The stone was cracking. Workers complained of headaches. One fainted every time he entered the south wing. It was later unfit for use for an unspecified reason. Everything inside was boarded up and a cross hung. The church insisted on cleansing it. But the very word cleansing provoked protests from the nobility. The Count of Brienne wrote in a letter to the Archbishop, "To cleanse means to recognize that there was a stain. And if there is a stain, it means that someone left it." There was no response. A silence began, which lasted for months. It was only in August that the controversy flared up again. At the Sorbonne, a student raised the question of the right of memory. He argued that Charles VI was not a madman, but a victim of time. He was expelled. A week later, he disappeared. His notebook was found on a pew in the chapel. In it was handwritten, "I am the voice you did not recognize." Meanwhile, outside the capital, changes were taking place. In Orléans, Toulouse, Lyon, old chapels mentioning Charles's reign began to be destroyed. New ones were being built in their place, with an emphasis on revival, on purity, on the new era of the crown. This was done without noise, without records. They simply grouted the stones, changed the slabs, burned the old masses. But the more they wiped away, the more anxious the people became. All over France, letters sprang up, anonymous, unsigned. They were read in taverns and at church gates. They said, "He's not gone yet. While his name is being erased, he is growing. He has become what was feared. You have blotted out the king, not the pain. And it doesn't die." Authorities tried to track down the distributors, to no avail. Every town claimed the letter came from outside. Charles VII had by then stopped eating in the evenings. He only ate during the day. He said that at night, food takes on a different flavor. His personal scribe wrote in his personal notes, "He does not speak his father's name, not even in a whisper, not even in his sleep. But every night before he goes to sleep, he puts his hand on his chest and waits as if something is coming back." This clerk was later exiled. No reason. A year later, when one of the oldest bishops of Paris died, the organ refused to sound during the farewell service. The priests took it as a sign. One of them, Brother Odo, during his sermon said, "He who has not received salvation demands justice." He was dismissed. Then he disappeared. His books were burned. By the end of the decade, the word Karl had become undesirable. Schools taught without naming names during the period from 1395 to 1425. It was simply said, a time of turmoil. One of the new chancellors ordered the demolition of a wall in the archives that was rumored to contain the last speeches of the Mad King. The wall collapsed. Only ashes were found behind it, but on one of the surviving boards was scrawled, "I am the one who was not waited for." Afterwards, the chronicler Rainier wrote, "He left no throne behind. He left the void we call power." So France entered a new century, with a new king, a new council, a new church, but with a shadow that no one could burn or name.